The sun over Fob Bastion was a merciless hammer beating down on the cracked concrete of the flight line. It bleached the color from everything, leaving only shades of dust, sand, and sweat. Here in the heart of the Korean Republic, silence was a rare and precious commodity, usually broken by the whine of turbines, the distant crump of artillery, or the metallic clatter of tools. But for Technical Sergeant Elena Rostova, silence had a texture. It lived in the space between heartbeats and the cool gray skin of the machine she tended. Her machine was an A-10 Thunderbolt II, officially designated Hog 7-1. To the pilots, she was a savior. To the enemy, a demon. To the mechanics who worked under Elena, she was a temperamental beast. But to Elena, she was a tomb. Her fingers, stained with grease and hydraulic fluid, traced the seam of a titanium plate below the cockpit. They were steady, precise moving, with an economy born of 1,000 hours of practice. Every rivet, every screw, every hairline scratch was a word in a language only she seemed to fully understand. Her team, a trio of younger airmen, kept a respectful distance. They knew Sergeant Rostova's pre-flight ritual was sacrosanct. It was more than a checklist. It was a communion. Torque wrench, she said, her voice low and even, not looking up. Airman Miller, barely 20, and still possessing a sun-bleached optimism that hadn't yet been eroded by the Korean dust, placed the tool in her outstretched hand. He saw the focus, the sheer, unwavering intensity in her posture. He, like the others, mistook it for simple dedication. They called her the oracle behind her back because she could diagnose an engine flaw from a subtle change in its pitch or predict a hydraulic leak before it ever dripped. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see that her meticulousness was a form of penance. Her mind wasn't on the torque specifications. It was 6 months in the past, in this very same hangar bay. The air had been thick with the smell of ozone after a thunderstorm, and the laughter of First Lieutenant Anya Sharma had echoed off the corrugated steel walls. Anya, with her crooked smile and eyes that held the fiery spark of a comet, had been leaning against the Warthog's enormous GAU-8 Avenger cannon. "You treat her better than you treat any man," Anya had teased her pilot's helmet tucked under her arm. "One of these days, you're going to give her a name, buy her flowers." "She already has a name," Elena had replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "Hog 7-1, and she prefers oil to roses." The memory was a physical thing, a shard of glass wedged beneath her ribs. She tightened the bolt, the click of the wrench unnaturally loud in the ambient heat. Click. One more check. One more step. One more fraction of an inch closer to an unattainable perfection. The official report had been clear enemy fire, a lucky shot with a man-pad that had crippled Anya's controls. No fault of the aircraft, no fault of the maintenance crew. But Elena remembered her last inspection of that plane. A pressure reading that was a fraction of a PSI off-spec. She'd noted it, debated grounding the bird, but the operational tempo was high. The grunts on the ground needed air support. She had signed off on it, convincing herself it was within acceptable parameters. It was a ghost that had followed her ever since. The ghost of a single insignificant number. "Sergeant," Miller's voice cut through the haze of her thoughts. "Ops just radioed. They're moving up the sortie. Need her ready in 30. Elena blinked, the present snapping back into focus. The sun, the heat, the distant rhythmic thud of a 50 cal being tested on the firing range. She slid out from under the fuselage, her movements fluid and economical. Her gray eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept over the aircraft one last time. Every panel secure, every line clean. She gave a curt nod. "She's ready," Elena stated. It wasn't a boast. It was a fact. Hog 7-1 was always ready, because in her mind, if this machine was perfect, if it was an unflawed, invulnerable extension of her will, then maybe, just maybe, it could keep the next pilot safe. It could do what she had failed to do for Anya. As the flight crew began to prep the cockpit, and the pilot, a cocky young captain with a swagger she found irritating, did his walk around, Elena stood back. She crossed her arms, her shadow a long, stark line on the glaring white concrete. She was a guardian, standing vigil over a sarcophagus, ensuring the ghosts within remained undisturbed, and that the metal beast she both loved and loathed would fly true. Hours later, Hog 7-1 returned its shadow, sweeping across the tarmac like a bird of prey, coming home to roost. The mission had been a success. The young captain was all adrenaline and bravado as he descended the ladder, recounting the sortie to the ground crew. Elena ignored him. Her focus was solely on the machine as it ticked and groaned, cooling in the thin evening air. The scent of burnt jet fuel, a perfume she once found comforting, now clung to the air like a shroud. After her team had completed their post-flight checks, and the captain had swaggered off to debrief, Elena found herself with a rare moment of solitude. The hangar was vast, and echoing the setting sun, casting long, distorted shadows through the open bay doors. She felt an irresistible pull, a need to climb into the cockpit herself. It was a place she seldom entered, the domain of pilots, a world of instruments and flight she understood academically, but not instinctively. She hoisted herself up the metal, groaning under her weight. The cockpit was cramped, an intimate space built for one. It still held the faint, lingering scent of Anya, a mix of leather mint gum and something uniquely her, something vibrant and alive that defied the sterile environment. Elena ran her hand over the worn leather of the ejection seat, her fingers searching for something they couldn't name. Her thumb brushed against a hard edge wedged deep in the seam between the seat cushion and the armored plating. Curious, she worked it free. It was a small, laminated photograph, no bigger than her thumb, its edges soft with wear. A selfie taken on a rare day off. In it, a younger Elena was half smiling, her usual stern expression softened, while Anya grinned manically, her arm thrown around Elena's shoulders. On the back, written in Anya's looping, confident script, were the words, "The A-Team, unstoppable." Below the words was a tiny, childish doodle of a warthog, but this one had been drawn with bright, ridiculous pink wings. The image hit her with the force of a physical blow, and the sterile quiet of the cockpit dissolved into the warmth of a memory. The scene replayed in her mind, vivid and painfully clear. It was a rainy night, one of the few that ever graced Korea's arid landscape. The rhythmic drumming on the roof of their shared container housing unit was a soothing counterpoint to the distant rumble of the war. They were cleaning their kits, a bottle of contraband vodka shared between them. Anya was polishing her helmet, humming a tune from a band Elena had never heard of. "You know what this place needs," Anya had said suddenly, holding her helmet up to the dim light. "Flair, panache. We're surrounded by 50 shades of beige. It's soul-crushing." Elena had grunted, her attention focused on recalibrating a diagnostic tool. "It's a war zone, Anya, not a fashion show." Exactly my point." Anya had swung around, her eyes alight with mischief. "War is ugly, so we fight back with beauty, or at least with absurdity. I'm telling you, Elle, if we painted the nose of my hog a glorious shade of shocking pink, the enemy would be so confused they'd just lay down their arms." Elena had finally looked up, a rare smile touching her lips. "You'd be court-martialed for defacing government property." "Worth it," Anya had declared, taking a swig from the bottle. "Think of the psychological impact. They wouldn't know what to do. Plus, it would honor all the badass women who came before us. A pink warthog. It's poetic. She'd grown more serious then, her voice softening. Promise me, Elle. If I ever buy it out here, don't let them just put my name on a boring plaque in a dusty hallway. Do something loud. Do something they'll talk about for years. Don't be morbid. Elena had chided, turning back to her work, uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. I'm not being morbid, I'm being iconic. Anya had shot back her laughter, filling the small space. Promise me. Paint her pink for me. Back in the cold, silent cockpit, Elena's fingers clenched around the tiny photograph. The memory was no longer just a fond echo. It was a mandate. A promise she had dismissed as a drunken joke now felt like a sacred vow. It was absurd, insane, an act of career suicide. It violated every rule, every regulation that formed the rigid spine of her existence. And yet, for the first time in 6 months, a flicker of purpose cut through the fog of her grief. It wasn't about defiance. It wasn't about breaking the rules for the sake of it. It was about fulfilling a final wish. It was about creating a memorial not of cold stone or polished brass, but of steel engine oil and a brilliant, impossible splash of color. It was about making the silence of the metal scream Anya's name. She slid out of the cockpit, the photograph clutched tightly in her palm. Her gaze fell upon Hog 7-1, bathed in the twilight glow. It was no longer just a machine, a weapon, or a tomb. It was a canvas. The decision once made settled into Elena's soul like a stone. For the next few days, she moved with a quiet, unnerving purpose. Her grief was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with the sharp, clear frequency of her plan. She researched paint suppliers through the base's logistics network, calculated quantities, and mapped out the hangar's blind spots. The methodical planning was a comfort, a familiar process of problem-solving, applied to an entirely unfamiliar, illicit task. This fragile peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The air raid siren began its terrifying two-tone wail, a sound that cut through the mundane drone of the base and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through every living soul. There was no ramp-up, no warning, just the sudden shrieking command to move. Scramble, scramble, all birds, now KIF mortar teams, hitting the wire at Sector Gamma. The voice of the operations officer crackled over the hangar's loudspeakers, strained and urgent. Instantly, the hangar erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. Elena's team, who had been lazily cleaning tools moments before, moved as one. There was no panic, only the focused urgency of well-drilled professionals. Miller, get the ordnance loaded, HEI rounds, full loadout. Elena yelled, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Davis power cart now, I want those engines spooling 60 seconds ago. Her personal mission vanished, vaporized by the immediate life-or-death demands of her duty. This was her other ritual, the violent counterpart to her quiet inspections. She was the conductor of this orchestra of fuel steel and explosives. As her team swarmed around Hog 7-1, she was already connected to the comms panel running the final systems check with a speed that bordered on instinct. The tactical radio frequency, usually muted in the hangar, had been patched through the main speakers by a frantic controller. Amidst the chaos of her own work, Elena became a reluctant audience to the drama unfolding in the barren hills miles away. Due to eking contact, we are pinned down. I say again, pinned down, grid coordinate 479er Epsilon. The voice was unnaturally calm, but the distorted bursts of automatic gunfire in the background told the real story. We have multiple enemy positions in the rocks above us. We can't move. Copy that, Ghost Leader. The Air Support Operations Center ASOC controller replied. Hog 7-1 is spinning up ETA 5 minutes. Can you mark your position? But negative ASOC too much incoming. Flares will give away our exact hide. The KIF are bracketing us with RPGs. There was a pause filled by the sound of a heavy machine gun opening up. Just tell your pilot to look for the friendlies getting their asses shot off. He'll find us. Elena felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had heard voices like that before. The sound of a man who has accepted the very real possibility of his own death and is now focused only on the mechanics of survival. She double-checked the connection on a fuel line. Her movements swift and sure, even as her mind was miles away in those rocks. She pictured Anya in a similar situation, her voice cool and steady as she reassured a ground team that help was on the way. Hog 7-1 is off the deck, the tower announced. Elena watched through the open bay doors as the Warthog, laden with weapons, clawed its way into the sky with its distinctively brutish grace. The pilot, the same cocky captain from before, was now just a disembodied voice. Ghost Leader, this is Hog 7-1 on station. I see multiple muzzle flashes on the ridgeline east of your estimated position. Confirm you are the westernmost element. That's affirmative, Hog 7-1. The calm voice Ghost returned. The Hornet's nest is directly above you. We need you to walk the GAU across that ridge, danger close. I accept all risk. Elena held her breath. Danger close were two of the most terrifying words in the lexicon of war. It meant the bombs would be falling feet, not yards, from friendly troops. It required absolute trust between the pilot in the sky and the soldier on the ground. The hangar fell silent, everyone listening to the broadcast. Then they heard it. First a faint whine over the radio, then the sound cascaded into the iconic, terrifying roar of the GAU-8 Avenger. It wasn't a series of gunshots. It was a single visceral brrrt. A sound that felt like the sky itself was being torn in half. Even miles away, the sound vibrated through the concrete floor of the hangar. A moment of static-filled silence followed. Stew. Good. Good hits, Hog 7-1. Ghost's voice came back laced with a new tone, not relief but the grim satisfaction of a predator who had just been saved by a larger one. Enemy fire has ceased. You cleared the ridge. Tell Sergeant Rostova she keeps a fine machine. The message was so unexpected, it startled her. A direct address. A thank you not to the pilot, but to the mechanic. In the anonymous, hierarchical world of the military, it was a profound gesture. The tension in Elena's shoulders eased for the first time since the siren had sounded. The immediate crisis was over. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving the familiar ache of fatigue in its place. But as she listened to the distant fading engines of Hog 7-1, the two realities of her life converged. There was the machine that delivered death with terrifying efficiency, and the men like Ghost who depended on it. And then there was her plan, a quiet personal act of remembrance that now seemed both more insane and more necessary than ever. An hour later, Hog 7-1 limped back into its bay. From a distance, it looked unharmed, but up close it wore the evidence of its recent trial by fire. The fuselage was streaked with black cordite stains, and a line of fresh pockmarks stitched across the left wing scars from small arms fire that had failed to pierce the Warthog's famously tough hide. The pilot, Captain Davies, was no longer cocky. He was pale and subdued, the adrenaline having been replaced by a weary recognition of his own mortality. Elena and her team began their work immediately, the practiced, rhythmic dance of a post-flight inspection. But this time was different. The danger-close mission and the visible damage demanded a deeper level of scrutiny. For Elena, this meant stripping down panels that were usually only checked weekly, running diagnostics, typically reserved for major overhauls. Her pace was deliberate, unhurried, which quickly drew the attention of the man striding into her hangar. Major Marcus Thorne was a man carved from the same rigid material as the regulations he revered. He was tall, lean, and moved with an efficiency that bordered on aggression. His uniform was immaculate despite the oppressive heat, and his eyes, the color of cold slate, missed nothing. He was the wing operations officer, and to him an A-10 sitting in a hangar was a wasted asset. "Sergeant," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "Status report. I need 701 back on the flight line by 0600 tomorrow. We're expecting a KIF push in the valley." Elena didn't stop her work running a borescope into the turbine exhaust. "With respect, sir, that's not going to happen." She took multiple hits, and the pilot reported extreme G-force stress during evasive maneuvers. "I need at least 24 hours for a full structural integrity check." Thorne's jaw tightened. He walked over and ran a gloved hand over the bullet marks on the wing. "This is superficial, Sergeant. The Warthog is designed to take a beating. Patch the holes, run the engine diagnostics, and get her back in the fight. Don't get sentimental." The accusation, subtle as it was, landed like a slap. Sentimental. It was a word often used to dismiss the concerns of female personnel, a coded way of saying emotional, unreliable. Elena slowly retracted the scope and rose to her full height, meeting his gaze directly. My job isn't sentimental, Major. It's to ensure that when a pilot like Captain Davies has to pull a 10G turn to avoid an RPG, his wings don't shear off." She replied, her voice dangerously quiet. "And that requires more than patching holes." A tense silence descended, thick enough to taste. Her team froze, tools held mid-motion. Openly contradicting Major Thorne was a notoriously poor career choice. His slate-gray eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her, weighing her insubordination against her flawless service record. "You have 12 hours, Rostova," he finally bit out. "Have her ready, or have a damn good reason why not. A reason that I can put in a report to command." He turned and stalked away, his disapproval radiating like heat off the tarmac. The encounter left a bitter taste in Elena's mouth. He hadn't shouted, but his dismissive tone was worse. It was the quiet assumption that her caution was a flaw, a hindrance to the war effort. Fueled by a cold fury, she worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She would find a reason. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the aircraft was hiding something. For hours, she worked long after her team had retired, exhausted. Under the harsh, sterile glow of the hangar lights, she was a solitary priestess tending to her wounded god of war. Her instincts, sharpened by guilt and honed by endless repetition, drew her again and again to the port engine pylon, the main structural element that held the massive turbine to the fuselage. It had taken the most strain during the flight. Visually, it was perfect. The naked eye saw nothing, but Elena felt a wrongness there, a discordant note in the symphony of the machine. She cleaned the area meticulously before applying a fluorescent dye penetrant. She sprayed the surface, wiped it clean, and then applied the developer a fine white powder. She switched off the main hangar lights, plunging the bay into near darkness, and clicked on a handheld UV lamp. And there it was. Under the eerie purple glow, a jagged, luminous green line appeared, spiderwebbing out from a load-bearing bolt, a microfracture. Invisible in normal light, but a fatal flaw under the immense stress of combat flight. Had she patched the holes and sent it back up as ordered, the pylon would have failed. The engine would have ripped itself from the wing, sending the plane into an uncontrollable death spiral. She stood there for a long time, the UV light painting her face in an unearthly glow. There was no triumph in her discovery, only a profound and weary sadness. She had her reason for Major Thorn. She had saved a life. But she had done it by feeding the very obsession that was isolating her from everyone around her, proving to herself once again that she could never ever afford to miss a single detail. The scars on the plane were easy to see, but the ones it left on her were far deeper. The next morning, Elena stood in Major Thorn's office, the small air-conditioned room, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the hangar. On the desk between them lay the official report, complete with high-resolution images of the glowing green fracture. Thorn read it twice, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. He didn't offer an apology or praise. He simply signed the grounding order. Shh. Hog 7-1 is offline for a minimum of 72 hours, he stated, his voice flat. The replacement pylon strut will be on the next transport from Ramstein. Your diligence is noted, Sergeant. Diligence is noted. The phrase was so sterile, so devoid of human acknowledgement, that it was almost more insulting than his earlier skepticism. He had been wrong, and she had prevented the loss of a pilot and a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Her reward was 4 words of bureaucratic jargon. She simply nodded, rendered the proper salute, and walked out, the coldness of the office clinging to her far longer than the conditioned air. Back in the relative sanctuary of her hangar, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. Her team looked at her with a mixture of awe and fear. She had faced down Thorn and been proven right. She had earned their respect, but in doing so had also marked herself as an outsider, someone who operated by a different, more stringent code. Later that day, the official directive was posted on every communal notice board across FOB Bastion. It was printed on crisp, clean paper that seemed out of place amidst the grime and dust. Memorandum for all personnel. Subject: Annual Warriors' Day Commemoration. 1. All personnel will be required to attend a formal ceremony at 0900 on 17th August to honor the sacrifice and dedication of our armed forces. 2. The ceremony will include an address from Brigadier General Madsen, a flyover demonstration, and a static display of key air and ground assets. 3. This event serves to reinforce our commitment to excellence and remember those who have paid the ultimate price for freedom. Elena read the words, and a wave of profound cynicism washed over her. A static display. They would roll out a freshly washed Warthog, a polished Humvee, and a sterile-looking Apache helicopter. They would line them up like toys for the general's inspection. They would speak of honor and sacrifice in carefully prepared speeches delivered by men who hadn't seen the inside of a cockpit in a decade. It was a performance. A piece of theater designed to create a clean, palatable narrative of the war for visiting dignitaries and the media. It had nothing to do with the truth. She knew the truth of fear-laced sweat, the smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with blood, the gut-wrenching silence after a friend's voice vanishes from the radio. Her mind immediately went to Anya. Anya, who had despised meaningless ceremony. Anya, who had lived with a vibrant, chaotic energy that could never be captured on a memorial plaque. They would read her name, First Lieutenant Anya Sharma, along with a list of others, and it would be just a sound, a syllable lost in the wind. The reality of her, the fire in her spirit, would be absent. The commemoration felt not just empty, but like a betrayal. Elena's gaze drifted to Hog 7-1, sitting wounded in the bay, its port engine shrouded in scaffolding. That machine was a truer memorial than any polished display. Its metal skin bore the real scars of the war. It had been there for Anya's last flight. It had felt the impact of the missile. It held the echoes of her final moments. The memory of their last conversation returned no longer as a painful whisper of grief, but as a clear, resonant command. Do something loud. Do something they'll talk about for years. Paint her pink for me. The idea, once a fleeting, impossible fantasy, now solidified into a concrete plan. It was an act of profound insubordination, a flagrant violation of every rule she had built her life around. The consequences would be severe. A court-martial was a certainty. Dishonorable discharge, the end of her career. She weighed that future against the present, against the hollow promise of Warrior's Day. What was the value of a career spent serving a system that would remember its heroes with such empty gestures? Her promise to Anya was the only thing that felt real, the only act that seemed to hold any meaning. To paint the Warthog wouldn't be an act of vandalism. It would be an act of translation, translating her silent personal grief into a language the entire base would be forced to understand. It would be a memorial that was loud, defiant, and full of the same beautiful, rebellious flair that had defined her lost friend. Standing there in the quiet of her hangar, surrounded by the tools of war, Elena Rostova made her decision. She would not let Anya's memory be sanitized. She would give her a monument made of steel, and she would paint it in the color of a sunrise. The first rule of turning an idea into an action is logistics. Elena's decision, made in the quiet solitude of her hangar, now faced the harsh realities of the physical world. The most significant obstacle was the paint itself. She couldn't use standard hardware store paint. It would peel and blister under the extreme temperatures and aerodynamic stress of flight. She needed military-grade two-part epoxy paint, the kind designed to adhere to the composite and metal skin of a high-performance aircraft. And she needed it in a color that, in the strictly regulated and earth-toned world of military supply, was tantamount to contraband. There was only one place on Fob Bastion that might harbor such an anomaly: the sprawling, labyrinthine warehouse known as the Supply Depot, run by a man who was a base legend, Staff Sergeant Sully Sullivan. Sully wasn't a criminal, but he was a master of the unwritten rules. He operated a complex barter system that kept the base running far more efficiently than the official supply chain. If you needed a rare part for a generator or a specific type of battery that was buried in paperwork, Sully was the man to see, provided you had something of equal or greater value to trade. Elena had her currency. For the past month, she had spent her spare evenings in the avionics lab tinkering with a fried navigation module from one of the C-130 transport planes. The unit had been officially condemned, a replacement ordered through channels that would take 6 months to arrive. But Elena, with her surgeon's patience and an innate understanding of circuitry, had found the flaw. She had painstakingly replaced a series of microscopic processors, effectively resurrecting a piece of equipment worth more than her annual salary. She found Sully in his office, a small cage of chain-link fence in the center of the cavernous warehouse. He was a short, stocky man with a cherubic face that belied a mind as sharp as a razor. He was hunched over a manifest, making notes with a pencil. Elena said, placing the heavy gray navigation module on his cluttered desk. He looked up, his eyes immediately assessing the unit. He whistled a low note of genuine appreciation. "The Ghost. I heard you were working on it. Didn't think you'd actually pull it off. What do you want for it?" Rostova first dibs on the new pneumatic toolkits. "A case of the good coffee from the Navy stores." "I need paint," she said, her voice even. "Just an easy day," he shrugged. "Got gallons of haze gray desert tan. Take your pick." "I need something specific." she continued, keeping her gaze steady. It's for a personal project, a tribute. I want to paint the toolbox of a friend we lost. It was a plausible lie touching just close to the truth. Grieving soldiers often created small personal memorials. Sully leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from amiable to wary. What kind of specific? 4 quarts of high-adhesion, chemical-resistant epoxy, she said, reciting the specifications from memory. Matte finish. The color code is Pantone 705C. Sully's eyebrows shot up. He scribbled the number down and typed it into his ancient, dust-covered computer terminal. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Quartz pink, he said, more to himself than to her. He looked back at Elena, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. That's a hell of a color for a toolbox, Sergeant. This isn't for some kind of prank, is it? Because if Thorne finds out I'm supplying materials for base vandalism, it's not a prank, Elena said firmly. The raw sincerity in her voice seemed to disarm him. It's a promise. The project will be quiet, respectful, and contained. You have my word. Sully chewed on the end of his pencil, his gaze darting from the priceless navigation module on his desk to Elena's unwavering eyes. He was a logistician at heart. He understood value. The C-130 module would get the entire transport wing singing his praises. It was a golden ticket. All she wanted in return was 4 cans of useless, oddly colored paint that had probably been sitting on a shelf for a decade, likely ordered for some long-forgotten morale project. From a purely transactional standpoint, it was the deal of a lifetime. All right, Rostova, he said, finally making his decision. But this conversation never happened. The nav module showed up in a mislabeled crate. The paint you're looking for doesn't exist in my inventory. We clear. Crystal, Elena replied. He led her deep into the maze of shelves to a dusty corner marked Specialty Coatings. There on the top shelf sat 4 gray cans stenciled with a series of codes. The only indication of their contents was a small, faded swatch of color on the lid, a soft, muted, beautiful quartz pink. Elena left the depot a few minutes later, carrying a heavy, unmarked cardboard box. The weight of the cans felt immense, far heavier than their physical properties suggested. This was the point of no return. The idea was now a tangible object. The mission was underway. With the paint secured and hidden in a locked maintenance locker, Elena's plan transitioned from a question of if to one of how and when. She spent the next 2 days meticulously repairing Hog 7-1, her focus on the task, providing a welcome shield against the enormity of what she was about to do. The work was complex, requiring a level of precision that absorbed her completely, and for hours at a time she could almost forget the illicit cargo waiting in the corner of her hangar. On the evening the repairs were completed, she found herself too restless to stay in her quarters. She bypassed the crowded mess hall and headed for the perimeter fence, a place where soldiers often went to find a moment of solitude. The sun was setting, casting the distant jagged mountains in silhouette and bleeding spectacular shades of violet and rose across the sky. The air was finally cooling, and a quiet calm settled over the base. She was leaning against a concrete barrier, tracing the seam of a crack with her finger, when a voice spoke from beside her. Sergeant Rostova. She turned her hand, instinctively dropping to her side. The man was tall and lean, moving with a quiet economy that marked him as something other than a mechanic or a pilot. He wore a sterile tan flight suit, but carried himself with the patient stillness of a hunter. She didn't recognize him at first. Hi, I'm Sergeant Cole Donovan. He said, his voice the same calm, steady tone she remembered from the radio. My friends call me Cole. My team, they called me Ghost Leader. Recognition dawned. This was the man from the rocks, the voice from the chaos. His face was sharp and angular with observant gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was open and direct. Donovan, Elena acknowledged her posture remaining guarded. I wanted to thank you in person, he said, gesturing vaguely towards the flight line. My team and I, we were the ones you pulled out of the fire the other day. That message I sent, it wasn't enough. The work you do, Sergeant, it's the reason we're standing here. Elena was taken aback by the directness of the gratitude. Praise was a rare currency on the base, and it was almost never traded between the air wing and the ground pounders they supported. I just do my job. She deflected the words, feeling inadequate. You do more than that, he countered gently, leaning against the barrier beside her, though keeping a respectful distance. Everyone knows you do. Hog 7-1 was Lieutenant Sharma's bird, wasn't it? The mention of Anya's name was so unexpected that Elena's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. She simply nodded, her throat suddenly tight. She flew cover for us on a bad op in the Zarin Valley last year. Cole continued, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Held off a whole KIF platoon with one gun run so we could pull our wounded out. She was fearless. I was sorry to hear we'd lost her. He spoke of her with a simple, profound respect that cut through Elena's defenses. He wasn't offering pity or platitudes. He was sharing a memory, acknowledging Anya's existence as a warrior. She was my best friend. Elena found herself saying the admission, surprising even herself. Cole nodded slowly. Out here you carry ghosts, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I've got my own. A young spotter kid named Evans made a bad call on a windy day. My bad call, his price. He paused, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the distant hum of the base's generators. The brass gives you a plaque. Your buddies give you a drink. But the ghost, that's yours to carry alone. The trick is finding a way to honor them, a way that makes the weight a little easier to bear. In that moment, Elena felt a profound sense of being seen. This man, a stranger she knew only as a voice on the radio, understood the precise nature of her burden in a way no one else had. He didn't know her secret plan, but he understood the motivation behind it, as if she had spoken it aloud. He understood the need for a memorial that was more than just an empty ceremony. I'm trying to, she said softly. He gave her a long, searching look, and a flicker of understanding passed between them. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Whatever it is, he said finally, make it count. He pushed himself off the barrier. I have watch. Stay safe, Sergeant Rostova. You too, Donovan. She watched him walk away, his figure melting into the deepening twilight. The sky before her was now a brilliant canvas of deep oranges and soft, dusky pinks. The conversation had settled something within her, solidifying her resolve into a diamond-hard certainty. She wasn't just doing this for Anya. She was doing it for the kid named Evans. She was doing it for all the ghosts carried by soldiers like Cole Donovan. She was doing it because in a world of prescribed grief and hollow ceremonies, a true act of remembrance was not insubordination. It was survival. The night before the Warriors' Day ceremony, a profound stillness settled over Fob Bastion. It was the deep, heavy quiet of a base bracing itself for a day of forced solemnity. For Elena, it was the silence of opportunity. Long after the last of her team had departed, she remained in the hangar, the colossal bay doors shut, sealing her inside with the gray monolith of Hog 7-1. Under the hum of the utility lights, she retrieved the cardboard box from its hiding place. The 4 cans of paint felt cold and dense in her hands, like anchors pulling her toward a fate she had chosen but could not fully comprehend. She lined them up on a small workbench, her movements deliberate, almost reverent. Prying open the first lid released a sharp chemical scent that cut through the familiar smells of oil and ozone. The color within was a soft, dormant pink, waiting for the hardener to awaken it. She was carefully measuring the two parts into a mixing tray when a faint noise made her freeze. A shadow fell across the floor. "SARS!" Elena's head snapped up. Airman Miller stood at the edge of the light, his young face etched with confusion and concern. He was holding a small data tablet. I forgot my PDI," he stammered, referring to his personal data pad. "I was just coming back to grab it. What are you doing?" His eyes fell to the open can of paint, and his confusion curdled into disbelief. "Is that pink?" The moment hung in the air, taut and fragile. Elena's mind raced through a dozen scenarios, a dozen lies she could tell. But looking at Miller's wide, honest eyes, she knew a lie would be a greater betrayal than the act itself. She simply dipped a mixing stick into the tray and lifted it, the thick, vibrant liquid dripping slowly back into the pool. "It's for Lieutenant Sharma," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of absolute truth in the silent hangar. Miller stared, his mouth slightly agape. He was new enough to the unit to have never met Anya, but he was not so new that he hadn't heard the stories. The pilot spoke of her with a kind of reverent awe. She was already a legend. He looked from the paint to Elena's grimly determined face, then to the massive scarred A-10 that had been Anya's chariot. And in that moment, the young airman understood. He didn't understand the depth of Elena's grief, but he understood the language of the gesture. "The speeches tomorrow," he said, his own voice quiet. "The ceremony. It's not enough, is it?" Elena simply shook her head. Miller took a deep breath, the decision forming behind his eyes. He set his data pad on a nearby crate, walked over to the workbench, and picked up a clean roller brush. "The GAU-8 housing is a composite blend," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It'll need a light sanding first to ensure proper adhesion." "Where's the grit paper?" Elena stared at him, a wave of shock and an unfamiliar surge of gratitude washing over her. She had been prepared to do this alone, to carry the full weight of the consequences. But in this quiet offer of complicity, her solitary penance had become a shared tribute. She gave him a single grateful nod and pointed to a supply cabinet. For the next 4 hours, they worked in near-perfect silence, a two-person priesthood performing a forbidden rite. The only sounds were the soft scrape of sandpaper, the gentle slosh of paint in the tray, and the whisper of the rollers against the Warthog's skin. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose. Miller, with his youthful energy, carefully prepped and masked the areas around the nose cone and the enormous housing of the Avenger cannon. Elena, with her surgeon's hand, applied the paint. It was not an act of vandalism. It was an anointing. Each stroke of the roller was deliberate, covering the dull, menacing gray with a color that spoke of life, of sunrises, of a spirit too vibrant to be confined to a memory. Elena felt the ghosts of the past 6 months begin to recede, replaced by the vivid present reality of this act. She wasn't painting over the scars on the metal. She was consecrating them. She was transforming this instrument of brutal, efficient warfare into a monument of fierce, unwavering love. As the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern horizon, they finished. They lowered the scaffolding, packed away the empty cans, and cleaned every trace of their work, leaving only the shocking, beautiful result. They stood back together side by side in the silent hangar. Hog 7-1 was no longer just a weapon. The aircraft, designed to be ugly, functional, and terrifying, now bore a splash of impossible grace. The nose cone and the cannon's cowling were a flawless matte quartz pink. It was a scar of a different kind, not of battle but of memory. It was defiant, it was insane, and it was the most honest memorial the base would ever see. The deed was done. The silence before the storm was about to break. The discovery was not made with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, slack-jawed stare. Airman First Class Peterson, arriving for the early morning shift to prep the static displays, was the first to see it. He had been tasked with giving Hog 7-1 a final polish. When he rolled up the heavy hangar door, the first rays of the Korean sun spilled inside, illuminating the impossible. He simply stood there for a full minute, his polishing cloth hanging limply from his hand. He blinked, certain he was still half asleep, that his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the image remained stark and undeniable. The most brutally effective close air support aircraft ever designed, a machine nicknamed for an ugly swine, had a bright pink nose. The news did not spread. It detonated. Within 20 minutes, a crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance from the hangar's entrance. Pilots, mechanics, and even cooks found excuses to be in the area, whispering and pointing. The reactions were a cocktail of disbelief, amusement, and outright horror. To some of the younger airmen, it was the greatest prank in the history of the Air Force. To the older career-focused NCOs, it was a sacrilege, a spit in the eye of tradition and discipline. Major Marcus Thorne heard the news from a breathless master sergeant who had run all the way from the flight line to the command post. Thorne didn't believe it. He assumed it was a communication error, a joke. But the frantic look in the master sergeant's eyes told him otherwise. When Thorne arrived at the hangar, his stride was tight with controlled fury. The crowd of onlookers parted for him like the Red Sea. He came to a dead stop at the edge of the bay, and for the first time in his decorated career, he was rendered speechless. He didn't see a tribute. He saw anarchy. He saw a $20 million asset defaced with a color that mocked everything he stood for. He saw a complete and utter breakdown of the good order and discipline that was the bedrock of his universe. And all of this on the one day of the year when the eyes of command were fixed squarely upon his base. It was a professional and personal humiliation of the highest order. His face, normally a mask of calm authority, became a thundercloud. And then he saw her. Sergeant Elena Rostova was standing beside the aircraft's landing gear, a checklist in her hand, performing what looked like a routine systems check. She was calm. She was methodical. Her composure in the face of the chaos she had unleashed was the final spark on the tinder of his rage. He marched toward her, his boots echoing on the concrete. "Rostova," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the surrounding whispers. "Report. Explain this. Now." Elena looked up from her checklist, her expression neutral. She met his furious gaze without flinching. "It's a memorial, Major," she said simply. The sheer, unadorned honesty of her answer seemed to infuriate him more than any lie could have. "A memorial," he repeated, his voice dripping with venom. "I see a circus act. I see the willful destruction of government property. I see a childish stunt that has made this entire wing a laughingstock on the day we are meant to be honoring our dead. This is not a memorial. It is an insult." "With respect, sir," Elena replied, her voice still infuriatingly level. "The insult is a ceremony that forgets the people it's supposed to be honoring. Anya Sharma hated beige. She would have hated a boring speech more." Thorne's face went rigid. The mention of the fallen pilot's name used as a justification for this madness was the final straw. He was done talking. He was a man of action, and order had to be restored. He turned to the master sergeant, standing nervously behind him. Master Sergeant placed Sergeant Rostova under arrest. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Confine her to her quarters. She is to speak to no one. Full investigation to follow. Thorn commanded his voice like cracking ice. He turned back to Elena, his eyes boring into hers. You are relieved of your duties, Sergeant. Your career is over. Two hulking security forces airmen, the base's military police, stepped forward. Elena did not resist. She handed her checklist to a stunned Airman Miller, who had been trying to make himself invisible in the background. As the MPs flanked her, she gave one last look at her work. The morning sun was now fully illuminating the aircraft, making the pink nose cone glow with an almost ethereal light. It was beautiful. It was perfect. As they led her away, a path clearing through the stunned onlookers, Elena Rostova walked with her back straight and her head held high. She had known the price of her promise, and now she was ready to pay it. The Warriors' Day ceremony began precisely at Oroka 900 under a sky of pale, indifferent blue. The formations were perfect, the uniforms crisp, and the polished boots of the honor guard reflected the harsh sun. At the edge of the parade ground, the static displays sat in silent, sterile perfection: an Apache helicopter, a Stryker armored vehicle, and an F-16 fighter jet. The conspicuous absence of an A-10 Warthog hung over the proceedings like a shroud. The entire base knew why. The air was thick not with solemnity, but with a tense, gossiping anticipation. Brigadier General Madsen, a stern man with a chest full of ribbons, delivered a competent but forgettable speech about duty and sacrifice. Then Major Marcus Thorne stepped to the podium. His face was a mask of iron control, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the lectern. He was there to introduce the roll call of the fallen, but everyone knew he had another purpose: to reclaim control of the narrative. Today we gather to honor the best among us. Thorne began, his voice amplified across the parade ground. We honor their discipline, their commitment to the chain of command, their respect for the traditions that bind us as a fighting force. Memory is a sacred duty, and we fulfill that duty through solemn, dignified remembrance. He paused, his cold gaze sweeping over the assembled troops. It is therefore a profound stain upon this day that this base has witnessed an act that flies in the face of those traditions, an act of vandalism disguised as sentiment that has desecrated a vital weapon of war and shown deep disrespect not only to this command, but to the very memory we are here to honor. The individual responsible has been apprehended and will face the full consequences of their actions under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. He was unequivocal. He was framing Elena's act as a crime, a childish tantrum that cheapened the solemnity of the day. A murmur rippled through the ranks of the ground troops, a low growl of dissent that was felt more than heard. Thorne was about to proceed with the roll call when a single figure detached himself from the formation of Special Forces soldiers and took a measured step forward. It was Sergeant Cole Donovan. A gasp went through the assembly. This was an unthinkable breach of protocol. Major Thorne froze, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Sergeant, return to your formation," he commanded, his voice dangerously low. Donovan did not move. He stood at attention, his gaze fixed not on Thorne, but on the visiting general. "Sir, permission to speak for the ground troops," he said, his voice calm and clear. General Madsen, intrigued by this unprecedented interruption, gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Donovan took a breath. "Major Thorne speaks of disrespect." He began, his voice resonating with an authenticity that Thorne's had lacked. "But with all due respect, sir, he doesn't understand what that aircraft means to us. To the men on the ground, the Warthog isn't just government property. It's the sound of hope. It's the ugliest, most beautiful angel you will ever see. And the pilot who flies it is not just a number on a roster. He then turned his gaze to the crowd. Last year in the Zaran Valley, First Lieutenant Anya Sharma flew Hog 7-1. My team of 6 men was compromised, pinned down, and minutes from being overrun. We were taking RPG and machine gun fire from 3 sides. We were dead. Then we heard her voice on the radio. It was the calmest voice I've ever heard. She told us to keep our heads down, that she was coming in hot. The parade ground was utterly silent, now captivated. Chiku, she rolled in danger close, so close we could feel the heat of her engines. She put the nose of that Warthog down and tore the ridgeline above us to pieces. She stayed on station for 20 minutes, drawing fire, refusing to leave until every one of us was safe. She was not just a pilot. She was a guardian. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I am alive today because of her. The men standing with me are alive today because of her. A name on a plaque is not enough for a spirit like that. A formal speech isn't enough. He finally looked directly at a stunned Major Thorne. Sir, I saw the plane this morning. What Sergeant Rostova did was not an act of disrespect. It was an act of loyalty. She gave Lieutenant Sharma a monument that is as loud, as unconventional, and as fearless as she was. For the soldiers whose lives Anya Sharma saved, that pink Warthog is not a disgrace. It's a medal. It's the most honest memorial on this entire base. When he finished, a profound silence held the field. Then one by one, the other members of Donovan's team, and then other soldiers from the infantry platoons, took one step forward, a silent, powerful vote of solidarity. Major Thorne stood at the podium speechless. His regulations, his order, his entire worldview had been dismantled in front of his command, not by the perpetrator, but by the very men the system was designed to protect. General Madsen looked from the resolute faces of the ground troops to Thorne's stunned expression, and then towards the distant quarantined hangar. The ceremony was forgotten. The real tribute had just been paid. While the drama of the ceremony unfolded on the parade ground, Elena sat on the edge of a thin mattress in her small, featureless room. The world had shrunk to these 4 beige walls, a narrow window showing a sliver of indifferent sky, and the silent, imposing presence of a military police officer stationed outside her door. She had been escorted here, formally read her rights, and then left alone with her thoughts. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum devoid of the familiar hangar sounds that had structured her life for years. In this quiet, her mind began to methodically calculate the cost of her actions. She was a pragmatist, and the ledger was grim. Article 92, failure to obey an order or regulation. Article 108, willful destruction of government property. The words of the UCMJ were as familiar to her as a maintenance manual. They spelled out her future with cold precision: a general court-martial, a sentence at the disciplinary barracks at Leavenworth, and a dishonorable discharge that would follow her for the rest of her life. Fear, cold and rational, settled in her gut. She thought of her parents, a quiet, proud couple who displayed her Air Force portrait on their mantelpiece. How would she explain this to them? How could she make them understand that this act of career suicide was not born of malice or madness, but of love? The life she had so carefully built, a life of discipline and excellence, was over. And yet beneath the fear, an unfamiliar emotion was taking root, a profound and liberating sense of peace. For 6 months, she had carried her grief like a secret wound, the guilt over that fractional pressure reading a constant, corrosive presence. She had channeled it into an obsessive perfectionism that had isolated her, turning her into a ghost, haunting her own life. Now the secret was out. The tribute had been paid. The promise she made to Anya, a promise made in jest but sealed in tragedy, had been kept. By acting, she had finally lanced the wound. Whatever happened next, whatever punishment the institutional machine deemed necessary, it could not take away the fact that she had done what she needed to do. The storm that had raged inside her for half a year had finally broken. The silence in the room was no longer the sound of her isolation, but the sound of its aftermath. A quiet knock at her door startled her from her reverie. It wasn't the guard. A moment later, the door opened a crack, and Airman Miller's head appeared. He looked terrified, his eyes wide as he glanced nervously down the empty hallway. Sarge, he whispered, slipping inside and closing the door silently behind him. I had to tell you. You're all anyone is talking about. Miller, you shouldn't be here. Elena said, her voice raspy. You'll get yourself in trouble. I don't care, he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. You didn't see what happened. At the ceremony, Major Thorne, he called you a disgrace. He was going to throw the book at you. Elena nodded slowly. I expected as much. No, but you don't understand. Miller insisted, his excitement overriding his fear. Sergeant Donovan, the sniper ghost, he stepped out of formation. He just walked right up and started talking. He told everyone about Lieutenant Sharma, how she saved his team. He told them that Warthog isn't just a machine to them. He said what you did wasn't a disgrace. He called it a medal. Elena stared at him, unable to process his words. And then Sarge. Miller continued, his voice cracking with emotion. All the other grunts, his whole team, and a bunch of others, they all stepped forward with him. Right in front of the general. They just stood there. Thorne couldn't say a word. They stood up for you. All of them. The information washed over Elena in a dizzying wave. She had been prepared to be a solitary martyr to pay the price alone. The thought that others, especially the combat soldiers she held in such high esteem, had not only understood her actions but had publicly defended them, was something her pragmatic mind had never factored into the equation. She had acted out of a deeply personal grief, never imagining that it would resonate as a universal truth to the men on the front lines. Her act had not been a lonely whisper after all. It had been a roar that had echoed in the hearts of others. After Miller scurried away, a new feeling settled over Elena, displacing much of the fear. A fragile, tentative sense of solidarity. She was still a prisoner in a beige room, her future still a terrifying unknown. But she was no longer alone in her conviction. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with the echoes of Donovan's voice and the image of those soldiers stepping forward. It was the quiet of knowing you had spoken a truth so powerful, others were willing to risk their own careers to stand beside it. For several hours, silence was Elena's entire world. But in war, silence is always temporary. It was shattered not by a siren or a shout, but by a sound that was brutally intimate and immediate, the sharp, percussive crack of a high-velocity rifle round, impacting the concrete wall just outside her window. It was followed instantly by the chaotic, deafening rattle of a heavy machine gun opening up from somewhere perilously close. The base-wide alarm began to shriek, but it was different this time. It wasn't the measured two-tone wail of a mortar warning. It was a frantic, unbroken scream, the sound of a fortress realizing its walls had been breached. Elena was on her feet in an instant, her heart pounding against her ribs. She pressed herself against the wall, peering through the small, reinforced window. The view was limited, but it showed her a world that had descended into madness. Soldiers were running, not in disciplined formations, but in scattered, desperate sprints, taking cover behind equipment and vehicles. Puffs of dust and concrete exploded from the ground as bullets stitched across the tarmac. A thick column of black smoke was already rising from the direction of the western perimeter. This was not a probing attack. This was a full-scale, coordinated assault. The comms system, which had been silent, crackled to life, broadcasting base-wide in a desperate attempt to maintain control. The voice was that of a young, terrified airman in the command post. All units, all units. We have a breach at Checkpoint Delta. KIF insurgents are inside the wire. I repeat, they are inside the wire. The sounds of battle intensified, the distinctive whoosh thump of RPGs, the steady rhythmic pounding of the base's 50 caliber defense turrets, and the frantic shouts of squad leaders trying to rally their men. Elena felt a surge of pure, agonizing helplessness. She was a sergeant, a leader, a technician, with an encyclopedic knowledge of the base's layout and systems. But she was locked in a room, disarmed and disgraced, a non-entity. She was a prisoner, and her home was being overrun. She began to pace the small room, a caged tiger listening to the sounds of a hunt. Her mind, starved for data, devoured the fragmented radio transmissions, assembling a grim mosaic of the battle. Pinned down near Hangar 4. They're using the maintenance stands for cover. Where the hell is our air support? F-16s can't take off. The runway is taking direct fire. They're not trying to take the hangars. They're moving south, toward the fuel farm. The fuel farm. Elena's blood ran cold. It was the base's heart and its most catastrophic vulnerability. Dozens of massive above-ground tanks containing hundreds of thousands of gallons of JP-8 jet fuel. A single well-placed explosive would create a fireball that would incinerate a quarter of the base and cripple its operations for months. She could visualize the layout perfectly: the main storage tanks, the network of transfer pipelines, the pumping stations. She knew the schematics by heart from having supervised maintenance on the automated fueling systems. She also knew where the weaknesses were. The junctions where multiple pipelines converged, the locations of the manual override valves that were notoriously difficult to reach under pressure. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The initial shock of the assault had worn off, replaced by the grim, grinding reality of a sustained firefight. The sounds from the comms grew more desperate. On command, the Eastern Fire Team is down. The insurgents have reached the primary containment berm around the fuel depot. We can't stop them. They're laying suppressing fire from the watchtower. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the foundation of her building, rattling the window in its frame. The lights flickered and died, plunging her room into the dim orange emergency lighting. The comms erupted in panic. Jesus, they hit a transfer line. A transfer line is hit. We have a fire spreading along the ground toward the main pumping station. Repeat, fire is spreading toward the pump house. Elena stopped pacing. She stood utterly still in the center of the room, her eyes closed, picturing the scene as clearly as if she were standing there. The pumping station. If the fire reached it, the pumps would rupture, creating a chain reaction that would detonate the main storage tanks. It was the doomsday scenario. "We need to shut down the main pipeline," a voice screamed over the radio. "The automated system isn't responding. Someone has to get to the manual shutoff valve at Junction 7. A pause followed by a voice filled with despair. "We can't get to it. It's on the other side of the fire. We're cut off. Junction 7. Elena knew exactly where it was, and she knew something else. She knew there was another way. The schematics flashed in her mind, a complex web of pipes and conduits. There was a secondary control access, an old service tunnel that was not on the standard emergency maps, a route that would bypass the fire completely. The knowledge was a physical weight, a burning pressure in her chest. The key to saving the base was in her head, and she was locked in a box, waiting for a court-martial. For a single paralyzing moment, Elena was frozen by the terrible clarity of her knowledge. The solution was locked in her mind, and she was locked in this room. The shouts on the radio grew more frantic, the seconds ticking away like footsteps toward a cataclysm. Her training, her discipline, her entire being screamed against inaction. She threw herself at the door, her fists hammering against the solid steel. "Guard!" she yelled, her voice raw. "Guard, get your CO on the radio now!" The MP outside, a young man with wide, frightened eyes, slid open the small viewing panel. Sergeant, stand down, returned to the center of the room. There's no time," Elena shouted, pressing her face close to the opening. "The fire is approaching the main pumps. They can't reach the Junction 7 valve. There is a secondary access point, a service tunnel behind Maintenance Bay 3. It leads to an auxiliary control panel. It's the only way to shut down the fuel line." She was rattling off technical specifics, banking on the language of engineering to cut through the fog of war. "If you don't get me to a command post right now, we are all dead." The guard hesitated, torn between his orders and the undeniable urgency and authority in her voice. He made a decision. He spoke rapidly into his shoulder-mounted radio, relaying her message. The response must have been swift. A moment later, he unlocked the door. "Let's go, Sergeant," he said, his weapon still held at a low ready. "They want to hear this." They ran through corridors choked with smoke and the acrid smell of explosives past wounded soldiers being dragged to cover. The base's primary command center had been evacuated, and a makeshift command post had been established in the heavily reinforced communications hub. When Elena was hustled inside, the scene was one of controlled desperation. Officers shouted into radios, and personnel frantically tried to reroute power and coordinate the scattered pockets of defenders. In the center of the room, standing over a large digital map table, were Brigadier General Madsen and a pale, grim-faced Major Thorne. Thorne looked up as she entered, his eyes blazing with fury. "What is she doing here? I gave a direct order. Get this prisoner out of my command post." "She claims she has a solution," Marcus, General Madsen said, his voice dangerously calm. He turned his attention to Elena. "Report, Sergeant. You have my attention. Make it fast." Elena ignored Thorne completely. She strode to the map table, her focus absolute. With a few swift motions of her finger, she zoomed in on the schematic of the fuel farm. "Sir, the situation is critical. The fire has cut off access to the primary manual shutoff at Junction 7. The team on the ground is correct. They can't reach it." She tapped another section of the map, a seemingly empty area behind a block of maintenance hangars. "What the emergency schematics don't show is the old infrastructure. This is a maintenance access tunnel for the primary electrical conduits. It was sealed in 2018, but the interior access hatch remains. It runs for 200 meters and emerges here." Her finger landed on a small, unmarked utility node just beside the main pump house. Inside that node is a secondary panel that can override the entire system and kill the fuel flow from the main tanks. It's a hardwired failsafe. It will stop the fire from reaching the pumps. She spoke with the unwavering certainty of a master craftsman describing her own work. There was no hesitation, no doubt. She was not theorizing, she was stating fact. The room fell silent, the officers staring at the map as if seeing it for the first time. Major Thorne looked from the screen to Elena, a flicker of disbelief warring with the cold logic of her explanation. General Madsen wasted no time. He had spent 30 years in the military, and he knew the sound of truth when he heard it. "You're certain, Sergeant?" "I supervised the last system-wide diagnostic on that network myself, sir. I have been in that tunnel. I know the way." The general's decision was instantaneous. He turned to Thorne, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Marcus, get a fire team to Maintenance Bay 3. Find that access hatch. Sergeant Rostova will guide them step by step over the radio." He then looked at Elena, his expression one of pure, pragmatic authority. "Sergeant, you are hereby attached to this command post. Take that communications console. The survival of this base may very well depend on what you do in the next 10 minutes." It was a stunning reversal. Elena, the prisoner, was now a vital, strategic asset. Thorn, his face a mask of bitter resentment, was forced to relay the general's orders, his voice tight, as he directed a team to the location his disgraced subordinate had identified. Elena slid into the chair at the comms station, the guard who had escorted her now standing behind her, as a protector, not a jailer. She put on the headset, the familiar weight, a strange comfort. The chaos of the battle still raged outside, but in this small corner of the war, the fight now depended not on bullets, but on the precise, unwavering memory of one woman. "Fire Team Bravo," she said into the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "This is Sergeant Rostova. I'm going to walk you in. Listen to me carefully." The world shrank to the sound of breathing and static in Elena's ears. On one channel, the chaotic symphony of the base-wide battle raged on. On the other, the focused, claustrophobic world of Fire Team Bravo, a team of 4 soldiers moving blind through the guts of the base with only her voice to guide them. "Advance 30 meters." Elena instructed, her eyes closed, visualizing the blueprint. "The tunnel will curve gently to the right. Watch your footing. There's a permanent water leak on the floor there." "Roger, Sergeant." The team leader's strained voice came back, punctuated by heavy breathing. "We hear it. Smells like a sewer down here." In the command post, a tense silence had fallen. The officers, including General Madsen and Major Thorn, stood like statues, their attention fixed on the speaker broadcasting the comms. They were all passengers on a journey being navigated by their prisoner. "The fire has reached the containment berm," an officer reported from across the room. "Estimating 90 seconds until it reaches the pump house structure." "Team Bravo status," Elena said, her voice betraying no hint of the pressure. "We're at the junction box you described behind the conduit," the team leader replied. "Found the hatch. It's old, rusted. We're working on it." The sound of metal groaning and men grunting in exertion filled the speaker. It was an agonizingly slow process. Every second felt like an hour. Elena could feel Major Thorn's stare burning into the side of her head, a silent testament to the bizarre, inverted reality of the situation. "We're through," the voice finally exclaimed. "Hatch is open. We see the utility node." Inside on the back wall, there will be a manual control panel. Elena guided. "Flip the protective cover. You are looking for a large red T-shaped handle. It is the primary fuel line cutoff." "So, Roger, we see it. Engaging now." There was a moment of agonizing silence filled only by static and the distant rumble of the fire. Then the team leader's voice returned, filled with a new tone of awe and relief. "Confirming. The handle is turned. I can hear the flow stopping. We have shut down." A collective audible sigh of relief swept through the command post. On the main tactical display, the flashing red icons indicating critical pressure in the fuel lines stabilized, and then turned a steady, reassuring green. The immediate catastrophe had been averted. With the threat of the explosion neutralized, the base's defenders could rally. The fire teams, no longer cut off, began to contain the blaze. The ground troops, led by men like Cole Donovan, launched a ferocious counterattack, pushing the surprised KIF insurgents back toward the breach. Within the hour, the attack was repulsed. The enemy was at the gate no longer. Hours later, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. The command post was quieter, the air thick with the smell of smoke and stale coffee. Elena was still sitting at the console, feeling strangely adrift, when Major Thorn approached her. The ever-present guard took a half-step forward before Thorn waved him back. He stood before her, his uniform smudged with soot, his face etched with a fatigue that went beyond the physical. He did not look at her, but at the tactical map now displaying the mundane details of post-battle cleanup. Secretary General Madsen has reviewed the preliminary after-action reports. Thorn said, his voice stiff and formal. In light of your direct and critical contributions to the defense of this base, the recommendation for a general court-martial is being withdrawn. Elena waited, saying nothing. He finally turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw something other than anger or disapproval in his eyes. She saw a profound, weary conflict. The regulations, Sergeant. He began struggling with the words. They are not arbitrary. They are the structure that prevents this. He gestured to the chaotic map. From consuming us all. What you did with that aircraft was an act of anarchy. It was a violation of the very order that allows us to function. He paused, his jaw working. But what you did in here, your knowledge, your composure, that was the embodiment of the duty and expertise of a senior NCO. My worldview does not have a place where both of those actions can exist in the same person. The system does not know what to do with you. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. It was not an apology, but it was something more valuable, an admission. An admission that his black and white world had been shattered by a splash of undeniable color. Maybe the purpose of the rules is to protect the people, sir, Elena said quietly. And maybe sometimes you have to remember the people to understand the rules. Thorn held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. You will still face non-judicial punishment under Article 15 for the aircraft, he stated, retreating to the comfort of regulation. There must be a consequence. Demotion in rank. Forfeiture of pay. It will be on your record. But you will remain in the service. He turned to leave, then stopped. The tribute. He said the word, tasting strange in his mouth. It will be noted in the official punishment record as a mitigating factor, for what it's worth. He walked away without looking back. Elena was left in the quiet of the command post, the threat of prison lifted. A demotion, a fine, it was nothing. She had won. Not against Thorn, but against the silent, crushing weight of a grief that had no official form. 3 months passed. The brutal Korean summer softened into a mild, golden autumn. The dust storms gave way to clear, crisp mornings, and the frantic tempo of the war settled into a tense but stable rhythm. On the flight line of FOB Bastion, much had returned to normal, but some things had changed forever. Staff Sergeant Elena Rostova. The demotion, a permanent formal mark in her record, moved with a new lightness. The obsessive, haunted intensity that had once isolated her was gone, replaced by a quiet, confident authority that drew people in. Her team, led by a more mature and assured Airman Miller, worked with a fierce loyalty that was the envy of every other crew chief on the base. She was no longer the oracle, a remote figure of awe. She was simply the Sarge, a leader who had taught them that the most important parts of a machine and a military are not always listed on the official schematics. The pink was gone from Hog 7-1. The official order had been carried out with solemn precision. The aircraft's nose and cannon housing were once again a regulation haze gray. But if one looked closely just below the pilot's side of the cockpit canopy, there was a new, unauthorized addition. It was a small, perfectly painted pink ribbon no bigger than a thumbprint. Elena hadn't painted it. No one ever said who did, but one day it was simply there. It was a quiet, collective act of defiance and remembrance. The pilots would touch it for luck before a flight. The ground crews kept it meticulously clean. They called it Anya's Mark. The plane itself had a new, unspoken name among the crews who knew its story, the Quartz Lady. Major Thorne, who saw it every day on his inspections, never once made a comment. His silence was a form of concession, a reluctant acknowledgement of a tradition he was powerless to erase. One afternoon, as Elena was signing off on a pre-flight checklist, a familiar figure approached. It was Cole Donovan, his gear packed, his tour of duty finally over. "Just heard you were heading home," she said, her voice even but with an undercurrent of warmth. "My ghosts are tired of this scenery," he replied with a slight smile. He walked over to the Warthog and gently touched the small pink ribbon with his gloved finger. "This is good work, Staff Sergeant." The title was a deliberate choice. He was acknowledging her official rank, but his tone imbued it with more respect than the word sergeant ever could. He knew as she did that true rank is not worn on the sleeve, but is earned in the hearts of those you fight alongside. "It's not just my work anymore," she said, her gaze following his. "It belongs to the whole squadron now." "Shall the best memorials always do," he said. He met her eyes, and in that shared look was a complete unspoken understanding of everything that had passed between them, of the burdens they both carried. "Stay safe, Elena." "You too, Cole." She watched him walk toward the transport plane that would take him away from the war, feeling not a sense of loss, but of gratitude for the connection they had shared. Later, she stood on the flight line as a new pilot. A young, determined first lieutenant climbed into the cockpit of Hog 7-1 for a dusk patrol. Elena gave her a final thumbs up. The pilot smiled, her hand briefly brushing against the pink ribbon before she sealed the canopy. Elena stepped back, watching as the Warthog taxied to the runway. The engines spooled up, their familiar, beloved roar washing over her. She thought of Anya not with the sharp, stabbing pain of guilt, but with a gentle, enduring ache of love. She had finally learned how to carry her ghost. She was a memory that flew alongside her, a source of strength, not a weight that held her down. Hog 7-1 thundered down the runway and lifted gracefully into the evening sky, its scarred, powerful frame silhouetted against a brilliant sunset, painted in shades of orange-violet and soft, dusty rose. Elena watched until it was just a dark speck against the vibrant colors. She was at peace. The tribute was complete. And in the quiet heart of the war machine, a small, defiant legacy of quartz pink now soared above the beige, a permanent reminder that the truest honor is not found in regulations, but in acts of love that refuse to be forgotten. Years would pass. The dust of Korea would be replaced by the mud or snow of other forgotten fronts. Generals would retire. Sergeants would become civilians, and new faces would fill the old hangars tending to new machines. Major Thorne would pin on the eagles of a colonel the memory of the pink A-10, a permanent, unmentioned crack in the foundation of his worldview. Cole Donovan would teach his children about the stars, never speaking of the ghosts he once carried under them. And Elena Rostova, after a long and distinguished career, would finally hang up her uniform, her hands forever remembering the feel of cold steel and the weight of a promise kept. But the story would remain. It was a story told not in official histories or commendations, but in the quiet moments between sorties passed from veteran crew chiefs to rookie airmen. It was a whisper on the flight line, a legend that attached itself to one particular battle-scarred A-10 that refused to be retired. It was the story of a war fought not just against an enemy, but against the forgetting. It was the legend of the day a woman taught a machine of war how to remember, proving that the most enduring scars are not carved by bullets into steel, but by love into memory. And that even in the grayest of worlds, a single splash of color could leave a legacy that would never fade.